Tanner Brode did not look at her when she walked up. He was watching the machines. It was 6:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in September, and the excavators were already inside the fence of the Calloway Street Community Garden. 3 of them, orange and enormous, their treads pressing down 16 years of composted earth. Brode stood at the open gate with a laminated permit in his left hand and a radio in his right, and when Josephine Mercer appeared at the entrance in her linen blazer and her floral blouse, he barely turned his head. "Keep it moving," he said into the radio. Then, to the nearest worker, "Ignore the woman in the garden." Josephine stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for anything in her bag. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved. "My name is Josephine Mercer," she said. "This land is mine." Brode turned then. He looked her over. The compact frame, the sensible flats, the small gold pin on her lapel that he did not recognize and did not ask about. He smiled the way men smile when they have decided the conversation is already over. "Sweetheart," he said, "I have a city permit." He held it up between 2 fingers, the way someone holds a winning hand. "Go call your grandkids. We've got work to do." He lifted the radio and signaled the machines to continue. The first thing Josephine did was look at his badge. She read the name. She read the permit number. Then she reached into the pocket of her blazer, the breast pocket, the one over her heart, and patted it once, lightly, the way a person confirms something they have known was there all along. "Everything I need," she said, "is already filed." Brode laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, more air than amusement. He turned away from her and walked back toward the gate. She photographed his badge. She photographed the permit. She photographed the permit number and the machine identification plates on all 3 excavators, methodically, one after the other, while the engines groaned and the first machine lowered its claw toward the nearest raised bed. By then, the neighbors had started coming. Odessa Quill was the first. Locks pinned up under her floral wrap, garden-stained overalls already on, canvas tote over her shoulder, reading glasses pushed to her forehead. She had heard the engines from her kitchen window and come out with her phone already raised. Behind her came 2 women from the block, then a man in a postal uniform still putting on his jacket, then 3 teenagers who had simply followed the sound of something wrong happening in the morning quiet. They filmed Brode, they filmed the machines, they filmed the raised beds, the tomatoes and the winter squash and the herbs and the plot of collard greens that had been tended by the same family on Calloway Street for 11 consecutive years. They filmed Josephine Mercer standing in the middle of all of it, upright and unmoving, the gold pin on her lapel catching what little light the morning offered. Brode noticed the crowd gathering and walked back toward her, permit still in hand. "Lady, I don't know what you think is happening here." "I know exactly what is happening," Josephine said. She did not look away from the machines. "I am documenting it." She was 74 years old. She had been awake since 4:30. She had known, from the moment she received the call the night before, that they would come early. That men like Tanner Brode always came early, because they understood that a thing half destroyed is harder to argue about than a thing untouched. So she had come earlier. What Brode did not know, what no one standing at that gate in the September morning light could have known from looking at her, was what that breast pocket held. Not a deed, not a letter, not a copy of anything, just a bar card. 51 years old, worn at the edges, her name printed across it in the plain type of a different era. She had not needed to use it in 11 years. She had planted those tomatoes in the spring of 2008, the same season she signed the papers that transferred this land into her name. She had grown them from seeds given to her 34 years before that by a woman named Cora Calloway, the woman this street was named for, on the afternoon Josephine passed the bar. The seedlings had survived 7 winters and 3 floods and 1 summer so dry the city had declared an emergency. They had survived everything, until this morning. The wood splintered with a sound like a door kicked off its hinges. The crowd at the fence went silent. Josephine did not look away. She watched the first raised bed collapse, watched the dark soil scatter and the vines fold under the weight of the machine, and then she turned. Not toward Brode, not toward the crowd. She reached into her blazer pocket, passed the bar card, and drew out her phone. She scrolled to a number she had not dialed in 11 years. She pressed call. It rang once, and whoever was on the other end picked up on the first ring. There are people who watch stories like this one because they believe something, that the truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's been buried. If that's you, you belong here. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And if someone in your life needs to see that quiet dignity wins, send them this. If this opening hit the way it was supposed to, you know what to do. The call lasted 4 minutes. She did not say much. She gave a name, a permit number, and an address. Then she said, "I'll need the chain from 2006 forward," and hung up. People who did not know Josephine Mercer would have expected tears or shouting, or at least a trembling voice. What she gave the phone instead was the same quiet precision she had given courtrooms for 5 decades. Information, sequenced, without waste. The machines had stopped by the time Odessa Quill arrived. Not because anyone ordered them to, because the operator, a young man from Decatur who had not been told anything about whose land this was, looked at the woman in the plain blazer standing in the middle of what he'd just torn up and simply could not keep going. Odessa had been in this garden since 2009. She had brought her mother here the summer before the old woman lost her sight, had guided her hands into the soil of the collard bed so she could feel the roots. She knew every raised frame by the family that built it, and she walked through the wreckage now the way you walk through a house after a fire, slowly, naming things. "That was the Delacroix bed," she said to no one in particular, stepping over a splintered cedar plank. 3 generations of sweet potatoes, started from slips Claudette Delacroix brought up from Savannah in 2011. She pulled out her phone and began recording, not frantically, methodically. She narrated each destroyed bed by family name, by crop, by year of planting, her voice even and clear. She had been a public school librarian for 31 years. She knew how to document. Near the east fence, 1 bed had survived, not by luck, but because the excavator had reached the fence line and stopped short of the property marker. Josephine knelt beside it without ceremony and pressed 2 fingers into the soil the way a doctor checks a pulse. The tomatoes were still standing. She called them the 1974 seedlings, which was not quite accurate. They were not the original plants, obviously, but they were grown from seeds she had carried forward herself year after year from seeds given to her by Robert Calloway in the summer of 1974. She had just passed the bar that spring. Robert Calloway was 81 years old, the original owner of this lot, and he had pressed a small paper envelope into her hand the day she told him she'd passed. Seeds from his mother's tomato plants, which had been growing on this land since before the Second World War. "Say it for the camera," Odessa said softly. Josephine looked up. Then she looked at the plants. "These are the 1974 seedlings," she said, her voice level. "Robert Calloway gave me the original seeds. He said his mother had been growing them on this land since 1938. I have grown them forward every year since. This is the 36th generation from that envelope." Odessa didn't say anything. She kept the camera steady. What Josephine did not say, what she did not need to say to Odessa, who understood, was that the continuous cultivation of those seedlings was not just sentiment. It was documentation. 16 years of neighborhood maintenance logs, seed-saving records, planting calendars, a paper trail of stewardship that predated Tanner Brode's permit by a decade and a half. She had not planned to need it, but she had kept it anyway, because that was what you did when the land was yours. Fenwick Lord had driven straight from the county building when she called. He was 38 years old and had worked in land records for 11 years. And in that time, he had learned that most property disputes came down to one of 2 things. Someone had not read the title, or someone had read it and hoped no one else would. He did not yet know which this was. Josephine met him at the gate. She shook his hand, thanked him for coming, and then reached into the breast pocket of her blazer and produced a business card. She handed it to him without comment. He looked at it longer than a person looks at a business card. The name, the firm, and below the firm, the bar number. A Georgia bar number issued in 1974, which meant she had been practicing law for 50 years, which meant she had been practicing law before Fenwick Lord was born. He said nothing. He slipped the card into his breast pocket with a care that was almost ceremonial. Then he looked at the ruined lot, at the intact bed by the fence, at Odessa still moving through the wreckage with her phone raised. "I'll need to pull the full chain," he said. 2006 at the latest, but probably further. Start with 2007, Josephine said. You'll see why. He drove directly to the county land records office. Did not stop. Did not call anyone first. Josephine watched his car until it turned the corner. Then she turned back to the lot, to Odessa's quiet narration, to the 1974 seedlings still standing in their bed by the east fence, and she began, with her phone, to photograph the lot boundary markers, all 4 of them, with timestamps. The lot had been purchased in 2008, not by the neighborhood, not by the city, by Josephine Mercer, personally, following the dissolution of a small nonprofit she had spent 3 years counseling through its legal formation and its slow, underfunded end. The nonprofit had owned the land. When it dissolved, the title had to go somewhere. Josephine had made sure it went somewhere specific. She had filed the transfer herself. She was the attorney of record. She had not told Tanner Brode any of this. She had not told the excavator operator. She had not told the neighbors gathering at the fence, filming on their phones, asking each other what was going to happen. She had simply said, "Everything I need is already filed," and let him keep talking. It was late afternoon when her phone rang. Fenwick. She answered on the second ring. His voice, when it came, was tight in the way that voices get when a person has found something they did not expect and is still deciding what it means. "Joe, did Brody's people actually run this title, or did they just assume?" The question Fenwick had asked from the records office parking lot the night before, did they actually run this title, or did they just assume, was not a question Josephine answered out loud. She thanked him, told him to drive carefully, and set her phone face down on the kitchen counter. Some answers, she had learned across 51 years of practice, are better confirmed in writing before anyone speaks them into the air. She let him work. By 10 o'clock that morning, Tanner Brode had assembled something resembling a press briefing. He had chosen the sidewalk directly in front of the lot, deliberately, so that the cameras would catch the excavators idling in the background, a visual argument that the work was already done and the question was already settled. He had a folding table, he had laminated documents, he had the particular ease of a man who had never once been told he was wrong by anyone who could make it stick. He called the community's objections sentiment. He used that word twice, and the second time he smiled when he said it, as though sentiment were a thing that dissolved on contact with permits.
"We have a city-issued demolition permit,"
he said, lifting one of the laminated pages so the cameras could see the official seal.
"Signed and sanctioned. The name right there, J. Mercer, City Liaison. That's your authorization. This is not a neighborhood dispute. This is a permitted development project, and we are proceeding accordingly."
He set the document back on the table with the particular confidence of a man who had never needed to read past the signature line. Nearby, a young reporter from the Calloway Courier, press badge swinging from a lanyard, notebook already open, turned toward the small cluster of residents who had gathered at the fence. He was looking for the story he had already written in his head, elderly resident versus developer. His pen was poised for a quote about loss and memory and the old garden that used to be. He found Odessa Quill instead. Odessa was already filming. She had been filming since she arrived, moving methodically along the fence line, narrating in a low, steady voice. This row here, that was the Delacroix family. Sweet peppers and collards, 4 generations. Her phone's timestamp ticking in the corner of every frame. When the reporter approached her, she did not stop filming. She simply redirected the lens. "You want a quote?" she said. "Then get your facts right first." She told him who Josephine Mercer was. Not the woman who had stood in front of an excavator at 6 in the morning. Not the elderly resident with the garden. She told him about Mercer versus Hartsfield County, 1987, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, a property rights case that had redrawn the boundary between municipal eminent domain authority and private title claims in 4 states. She told him the case was still cited in Georgia courts. She told him the gold pin on Josephine's lapel, the small raised fist he might have noticed, or might not have, had been given to Josephine by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund after she won it. The reporter's pen stopped moving. He looked down at what he had written, elderly resident, community garden, sentimental objection, and then back up at Odessa, who had already returned to filming the fence line and was narrating the name of another family's row. He closed the notebook. He opened it again to a fresh page. He asked Odessa if Josephine would agree to a formal interview. Odessa relayed the question. Josephine, standing 30 feet away with her back to the briefing table, considered it for a moment. Then she said, without turning around, "Not yet." She was not ready to speak publicly. Not because she lacked the words. Josephine Mercer had never in her life lacked the words, but because the record was not yet complete, and she had not practiced law for 5 decades by making arguments before the evidence was assembled. Let Brode talk. Let him laminate things. Let him say J. Mercer with that easy confidence, as though the name on a document were a door that locked from his side. She had noticed which J. Mercer he had cited. She had noticed it the moment he lifted the page. She said nothing about it. Sable Pruitt arrived at 11:30. She came on foot from a car parked half a block away, leather portfolio under her arm, heels precise on the cracked sidewalk. She was the kind of attorney who wore her confidence like a second suit, every movement calibrated, nothing wasted. She had reviewed the permit. She had reviewed the title search her client's team had provided. She had found no irregularities because she had looked at exactly what her client had shown her and no further. She handed Josephine the cease and desist letter personally. It was a professional courtesy, she said. She said it pleasantly. The letter was 2 pages. It ordered Josephine to cease interfering with permitted construction on city-adjacent property, cited the demolition permit by number, and referenced the J. Mercer authorization by name. It was, as legal documents go, thorough and confident and built entirely on the assumption that no one had looked any deeper than the permit itself. Josephine read it, all of it. She took her time. Then she folded it in half along the crease, tucked it into the breast pocket of her blazer beside the phone she had used to photograph Brode's badge 2 mornings ago, and looked at Sable Pruitt with an expression that was not hostility, and was not warmth, and was not anything Sable Pruitt had a ready category for. "Thank you," Josephine said. "I'll be in touch." Sable Pruitt walked back to her car. She did not look uncertain, but she walked a little faster than she had arrived. Odessa stayed until the light changed. She filmed every broken bed, every overturned row, every bare patch of earth where something had been growing for 16 years. She narrated each one by name, the family, the plant, the year they first put seed in that ground. Her phone's timestamp ran in the corner of every frame. "That's the record," Josephine had said, watching her. Odessa had not stopped filming when she said it. That night, Josephine sat at her kitchen table and opened the manila envelope Fenwick had couriered to her door. The single page inside was a certified copy of the county land record, the title chain clean and unbroken, every transfer documented in the precise, unadorned language of public record. She read it once. Then she set it flat on the table, set her tea down beside it, and closed her eyes. She sat like that for a long, still moment. Then she picked up her phone and said, "We file Monday." Monday came in cool and gray, the kind of morning that asks nothing of you, and Josephine Mercer gave it everything she had. She had set down her tea the night before and closed her eyes for exactly as long as it took to understand what the document in her hands meant. Not for herself, for the garden, for the 16 years of hands in that soil. Then she had opened her eyes, picked up her phone, and said the 3 words she had not needed to say in 11 years. "We file Monday." Fenwick Lord had known the moment he pulled the chain. He had been in that records office enough years to recognize when a file was clean and when a file was a trap someone had walked into without checking the floor first. Brode's team had done what developers often do with surplus land assumptions. They had traced the lot to a dissolved nonprofit, noted the dissolution date of 2009, and stopped there. They had never looked at what happened in 2008. What happened in 2008 was this. 1 year before the nonprofit dissolved, its board, advised by its legal counsel, had transferred the title to a private individual. The transfer was recorded at the county clerk's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2008. The attorney who drafted and filed the transfer instrument had signed the recording line in her own hand. Her name was Josephine Mercer. She had not merely owned the land, she had been the one to secure it. The nonprofit had not abandoned the lot when it dissolved. It had passed the lot, deliberately and legally, into the hands of the woman who had protected it from the beginning. Brode's permit had been issued on the premise of city-owned surplus property. That premise had been false from the first signature on the application. Every excavator, Every raised bed splintered under steel. Every permit document Tanner Brode had waved at workers and neighbors and a local reporter, built on a title search error his own team had made and never bothered to correct. Josephine had understood all of this before she finished the first paragraph of Fenwick's courier envelope. She had felt the particular quiet that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The moment a thing you have always known becomes a thing you can prove. She spent Sunday night writing, not frantically, steadily, the way she had written briefs for 51 years. Across the neighborhood, Odessa Quill was already at work. She had begun photographing the beds the morning of the demolition, not in grief, though grief was present, but in the methodical way of someone who had watched Josephine long enough to understand that documentation was not sentiment. It was infrastructure. Each photograph carried a timestamp. Each was labeled in her file names with the family who had planted that row and the variety they had grown. Calloway Henderson, Cherokee Purple Tomato, Birdsong Family, Dragon Tongue Bean, Rutherford Plot, Mortgage Lifter. The heirloom tomatoes Josephine called the 1974 seedlings, the ones grown from seeds given to her by the original landowner the year she passed the bar, had been identified by a horticulturalist Odessa had contacted through the State Agricultural Extension Office. The variety was documented. Heritage status, traceable lineage, continuous cultivation record going back decades. That single identification changed the valuation calculus in ways Brody's team had not begun to anticipate. Cultural property designation carries its own damages framework. The garden had not merely been property, it had been a documented living archive. That's the record, Josephine had said, watching Odessa photograph the wreckage. She had meant it precisely. Monday morning, Josephine filed the civil complaint named Brode Development Group on 3 counts. Criminal trespass on private property, willful destruction of private property, and fraudulent permit procurement. The exhibits were attached in order. Exhibit A, Brody's own permit, bearing the false premise of city-owned surplus land. Exhibit B, Sable Pruitt's cease and desist letter, the one Josephine had folded in half and slid into her blazer pocket without expression, now entered into the record as evidence of the developer's ongoing assertion of authority over land they did not own and had never owned. Exhibit C, Fenwick's certified title chain, running unbroken from the original landowner through the nonprofit through the October 2008 transfer to Josephine Mercer, attorney of record and sole title holder. She had told Brody the morning he stood at the gate with his laminated permit and his laughing workers that everything she needed was already filed. He had laughed at that too. What he had not understood, what none of them had understood, was that she was not speaking in future tense. The deed recorded at the county clerk's office in October 2008 had been filed for 16 years before Tanner Brode ever set foot on Calloway Street. The legal foundation of her claim had existed longer than his permit application had been a thought in his head. She had not needed to scramble. She had needed only to wait for them to finish demonstrating, in full view of neighbors and cameras and a local reporter, exactly what they had done. Across the city, in an office with a glass-top desk and a leather portfolio stamped with the Brode Development Group crest, Sable Pruitt received her copy of the complaint that afternoon. She read it the way attorneys read opposing filings, efficiently, looking for the weakness, the procedural gap, the exhibit that wouldn't hold. She turned through Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and reached Exhibit C, the certified deed, the full title chain, the recording line at the bottom of the 2008 transfer instrument. She read the name of the attorney who had recorded the original title transfer. She read the name of the plaintiff on the complaint cover page. She set the document down. They were the same woman. Sable Pruitt had spent the weekend preparing for a woman she thought she understood. She had read the complaint. She had read the exhibits. She had even, finally, read the name on the deed. But reading a name on paper and understanding what it means are 2 different things. And Sable Pruitt walked into that courtroom still believing she held the stronger hand. She was wrong about that. She had been wrong about it from the beginning. The hearing on the preliminary injunction drew more people than the gallery could comfortably hold. Odessa Quill had arrived an hour early and taken a seat in the second row, canvas tote on her lap, reading glasses pushed to her forehead. Fenwick Lord sat behind the plaintiff's table in a rumpled button-down, county seal lanyard around his neck, a certified copy of the title chain in a manila folder on his knee, the same folder he had couriered to Josephine's door 4 nights before. Tanner Brode sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that did not fit him as well as his hard hat did. He had left the reflective vest at the job site. He looked like a man wearing someone else's clothes. Sable Pruitt opened her argument with confidence, because confidence was the only move she had left. She presented the permit. She named the signatory. She laid the document on the lectern and said, clearly, for the record, "The permit bears the authorized signature of J. Mercer, City Liaison, confirming municipal sanction for the site development. This is not a trespass. This is a properly approved project." She paused for effect. And then Josephine Mercer stood up. She did not raise her voice. She addressed the judge the way a person addresses someone they have respected for a long time. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Josephine Mercer. I am the plaintiff in this matter. I am also a member of the Georgia Bar, 51 years this November. And I would like to introduce into evidence Plaintiff's Exhibit D." She lifted a single document from the manila folder and handed it to the clerk. That is the original 1991 Calloway District Landscape Ordinance. It bears the signature of Jerome Mercer, my late husband, who served as city planner for 22 years before his death in 2004. Jerome was J. Mercer. He signed a landscape ordinance in 1991. He did not sign a demolition permit. He has been dead for 21 years. And the permit Ms. Pruitt just presented to this court bears a signature that, upon examination, was traced, not signed, from a 1991 city document that Brode Development Group obtained through a public records request. The room did not erupt. It went very quiet. The particular quiet of people absorbing something they will not forget. Sable Pruitt's hand moved to her portfolio and stopped. The judge studied the exhibit. Then he looked at the permit. Then he looked at Sable Pruitt. "Counselor," he said, "I'd like to hear from your client's permit team about the provenance of this signature." Sable Pruitt had no answer for that. Because Brody's permit team had not run the title, they had not verified the signatory. They had seen the name J. Mercer on a public record, assumed continuity, and built an entire development claim on a name they never bothered to investigate. Fenwick Lord took the stand and told the truth in the careful, measured way of a man who has handled documents his whole career and understands what they mean. He testified that when Josephine Mercer handed him her business card outside what remained of the garden, he had stared at the bar number longer than was polite, because he recognized it. He had seen that number before. It was the bar number on the attorney's signature line of the 2008 title transfer from the Calloway Community Land Trust to Josephine Mercer individually. She had filed the transfer herself. She was the attorney of record. She was the sole title holder. She was, in every legal sense, the only person whose name had ever mattered on that lot. And Brody's team had never once looked for her. The judge granted the injunction before noon. He halted all Brode Development Group construction activity in the district pending full proceedings. He referred the permit application to the city attorney's office for fraud review. He noted for the record that the plaintiff had demonstrated a clear chain of title, a documented history of continuous use, and, in his words, a level of evidentiary preparation that this court finds exemplary. Josephine wrote that down, not because she needed to, because Jerome would have liked to hear it. The remediation order came 6 weeks later. Brode Development Group was directed to fund a full restoration of the Calloway Street Community Garden, raised beds, irrigation, the perimeter fence, under a remediation plan drafted by Josephine and submitted by the neighborhood. Every family that Odessa had named in her sworn exhibit was listed in the plan. Every bed would be rebuilt where it had stood. The heirloom tomato line, the seedlings grown from seeds given to a young attorney in 1974 by the woman who first trusted her with the land, would be replanted from the cuttings Odessa had saved in her kitchen window the morning the excavators came. Odessa had not mentioned those cuttings to anyone. She had simply taken them, wrapped them in a damp cloth, and carried them home in her canvas tote. Some things you preserve before you're asked to. Tanner Brode left the courthouse without a statement. He came down the steps on the north side, and Josephine was standing at the bottom with Odessa beside her, not because she had planned it that way, but because that was where the car was parked. He passed within 4 feet of her. She did not look at him. Not from contempt. She had spent 51 years learning that contempt is its own kind of weight, and she had no interest in carrying his. She was looking at the street, at the ordinary afternoon, at the city that had been there before Tanner Brode and would be there long after. He walked past. That was all. Odessa knelt at the fence line and pressed a small seedling cup into the chain link, a young tomato plant, the first cutting rooted from her kitchen window. She did not make a speech. She just pressed it in until the wire held it, stood, and dusted her hands on her overalls. It was not a monument. It was a placeholder, a quiet statement that something was coming back. If you have ever watched someone refuse to perform their own dignity, refuse to shout, refuse to perform, refuse to need the other person to finally understand, drop a 1 in the comments. Because that is what Josephine Mercer did every single day of this story, and it is the hardest thing there is. The final image is not of Brody or the courtroom. It is of Josephine kneeling in the turned earth of the restored lot 3 months later, pressing a seedling into the soil with her bare hands, the gold raised fist pin catching the afternoon light on her lapel. The truth had always been there, in the deed, in the bar number, in the name her husband signed 30 years before anyone thought to look. It was patient the way soil is patient. It did not need to announce itself. It only needed someone who knew where to look. If this story stayed with you, if you believe the truth finds its way out eventually, no matter how long it takes, subscribe. This is where those stories live. And if you know someone who needed to see what quiet, prepared dignity looks like, send them this. There's more on the end screen. Pick one and keep going.